Just a nurse. That's what Dr. Pierce called her in front of the morning huddle, his voice pitched to carry down the corridor like a scalpel through silk. Margaret Walsh didn't flinch. She didn't blink. She simply met his eyes with a flat, frozen stare and continued reviewing the cardiac monitor strip in her hands as if he'd said nothing at all. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical song above the ICU floor, and somewhere beyond the glass partition, a ventilator wheezed its rhythmic breath into a sedated patient's lungs. They didn't know they were standing next to a legend. They didn't know that the quiet woman with the cracked coffee mug and the wilting pot hose on her desk had held the line at the Baghdad embassy under sustained mortar fire, had performed emergency cricothyrotomies by flashlight in a basement bunker, had kept 37 wounded personnel breathing when there was nothing left but training and will. 8 months she'd been at Seattle General, 8 months of moving through the ICU with the calm efficiency of someone who'd already survived the worst the world could offer, and not one person on this floor knew her real name was Captain Margaret Walsh, United States Navy. Not one person knew she was here. The ICU at Seattle General occupied the entire east wing of the 7th floor, 22 beds separated by glass partitions and rolling curtains, a landscape of monitors and pumps and the soft hiss of oxygen delivery systems. Margaret had chosen the shift rotation deliberately, the 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. that gave her access to Admiral Kerrigan's charts during business hours, when the administrative offices were staffed and the documentation trails were fresh. She'd been tasked with the assignment 247 days ago, though no one had written that down anywhere. The Pentagon didn't file paperwork on deep cover operations. They filed them in encrypted servers and burned the originals. National Security Directive 47 had her name on a document that technically didn't exist, monitoring a witness to a Baghdad procurement scandal that had reached the highest levels of defense contracting and military acquisition. Admiral Kerrigan was the only person alive who knew the names, the account numbers, the dates. And he was currently 3 floors down in post-surgical recovery, waiting for his cardiac clearance before transfer to Margaret's ICU. She'd been expecting him for a week. The paperwork had come through on Tuesday. His EKG showed early signs of demand ischemia. They'd want him on continuous monitoring. They'd want him where she could see him. Where she could protect him. The September heat pressed against the hospital windows like a living thing, San Antonio's humidity making the glass sweat where the air conditioning struggled against the afternoon sun. Margaret's scrubs clung to her shoulders, navy blue with a small tear in the left pocket where she'd snagged it on a suture cart last week. Under her jacket, sewn so carefully into the lining that no one would find it unless they were looking, was a unit patch from the 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, Dark Horse Company, the one she'd served with for 7 years before her reassignment to intelligence operations. In the photograph stitched inside the patch, 18 faces looked back at the camera with the kind of confidence that only came from trusting the person next to you with your life. Half of those faces were crossed with black bands. She'd stitched those bands herself, one name at a time, and sewn the patch into her jacket on the night before her medical discharge papers were signed. It went with her everywhere now, a weight against her ribs, a reminder of what she was fighting to protect. Her hands moved across the chart for bed 14, a 67-year-old male admitted 3 weeks ago with a perforated ulcer, now in the slow recovery phase where complications came quietly. Margaret's handwriting was precise, economical, the penmanship of someone trained in documentation that could survive military court-martials and Pentagon audits. But it was the pattern she was searching for that no one else could see. She pulled the imaging reports from the file, an MRI from 2 weeks prior, ordered by Dr. Pierce's team for suspected mesenteric ischemia. She cross-referenced it against the hospital's radiology billing database using the terminal at the nurse's station, her fingers moving with casual efficiency while the day shift nurses bustled past with medication carts and fluid bags. The scan had been billed to the imaging center at 8:36 a.m. on September 12. But Margaret had pulled the patient's physical chart, and the nurse's note from that morning clearly documented that the patient had been NPO, nothing by mouth, only since midnight, and his last meal was 11 p.m. the previous night. MRI scans required a minimum 4-hour fast. The scan had been billed. The patient had never had it done. That was the 4th phantom scan this month. All ordered by Dr. Pierce's team. All billed to Advanced Diagnostic Solutions, the imaging company that had been awarded the hospital's exclusive imaging contract in June. Margaret's jaw tightened, not visibly, not enough for anyone watching to notice, but there was a small muscle in her temple that flexed once, twice, and then went still. The billing pattern matched a classic kickback scheme, one bill per phantom study, split between the hospital administration and the company, approximately $4,200 per scan. 3 phantom scans per week. For weeks. Roughly $50,400 in fraudulent billing. And that was just this month. She didn't need to pull the earlier months to know the pattern went back further. She'd been watching for 3 weeks, and the mathematics were clean as surgical stitches. Dr. Pierce and whoever was running the radiology department were moving money through the imaging contracts like it was the easiest thing in the world. They probably thought the ICU nurse with the coffee mug and the sad desk plant was too exhausted from 12-hour shifts to notice anything. They probably thought she was exactly what she appeared to be, tired, careful, keeping her head down. The break room was where she felt the first deliberate chill. Margaret had worked in hospital break rooms in Baghdad and Bethesda and San Diego, and she knew the acoustics of silence, the way a room could shift its temperature when someone walked through the door. It was 2:15 p.m. on Wednesday. She'd finished her medication pass and wanted the 9 minutes of solitude before the afternoon admit rounds. The break room had 4 people in it, 2 nurses from the step-down unit, a respiratory therapist, and an administrative assistant whose name was Jennifer something. When Margaret pushed through the door and moved to the coffee maker, every conversation stopped. Not paused. Stopped, like someone had hit a mute button. She poured coffee into her mug, the one with the small crack on the rim, chipped in Helmand Province when an alarm had jarred her hand 5 years ago, and stood at the counter for exactly 7 seconds. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Then Jennifer gathered her papers and left the room, and within 15 seconds, the 2 nurses found reasons to check on patients, and the respiratory therapist followed them out. Margaret stood alone in the break room with her coffee, watching the condensation fog the window that looked out over San Antonio's downtown, and didn't allow her hands to tremble. Not even for the space of a breath. Muscle memory took over, the same composure that had carried her through combat assessments and presidential briefings, the kind of calm that came from having already survived worse. She drank her coffee standing up. She counted to 12. She went back to work. By Thursday, the silence had a shape. It was an architecture Dr. Pierce had built with precision and deliberation. Margaret was 2 hours into her morning shift when she noticed the new assignment board. She'd been removed from the primary nursing rotation for the step-down unit where most of the complex cardiac cases discharged. She'd been moved to bedside care only, float assignments, whatever the charge nurse needed moment to moment. It was a subtle reassignment, not officially disciplinary, nothing that would have triggered an HR review, but it was unmistakably designed to fragment her routine, to limit her access to charts, to keep her moving between different patients instead of settling into the methodical review that had exposed the phantom scans. Dr. Pierce was competent. That was the part that mattered. He didn't just yell or bully, he was using hospital administration like a surgical tool, precise and effective. She'd seen this before, different countries, different operators, same playbook, marginalize the threat, create isolation, make her irrelevant before she became dangerous. He didn't know yet that she was dangerous. But he knew something was wrong. And then the doors opened, and Admiral Kerrigan came through on a rolling bed, his 4 lines already running, his oxygen cannula positioned under his nose like he was so accustomed to life support equipment that it had become part of his face. He was 73 years old, his hair a uniform silver, his eyes the color of the Atlantic in winter. The nurses moved around him with a standard post-surgical efficiency, transferring him to bed 7, running the cardiac leads, establishing his baseline vitals. Margaret stood at the medication dispensary, her hands moving with practiced calm as she prepared the routine post-op medications, but her eyes tracked every word on the monitor behind Kerrigan's bed. His heart rate was elevated, 94 beats per minute. His blood pressure favored systolic at 148/62. His O2 sat was 96 on 2 liters. Normal, textbook, exactly what a post-op cardiac patient should show. But Margaret had studied his file for months. She knew that Admiral James Kerrigan had been in Baghdad in the summer of 2009, that he'd been in procurement with the Defense Logistics Agency, that he'd seen something in those sandstorms and corrugated metal buildings that had been worth killing for. The Pentagon thought he was ready to talk. The Pentagon thought he'd be safe here. Margaret knew better. She also knew that no one on this floor, except possibly one combat-hardened man who'd already noticed her work style, was trained to keep him alive if someone decided Baghdad should stay buried. It was 6:16 p.m. when the visiting physician came through for consults, a man in his early 50s wearing a Marine Corps ring and the kind of posture that came from actual service, not weekend warrior fantasies. He was consulting on bed for a septic patient whose antibiotic coverage wasn't responding, and Margaret was running the sepsis protocol, blood cultures, lactate level, fluid bolus, empiric broad-spectrum coverage. The man watched her work for exactly 17 seconds. He watched her rapid assessment, the way she'd organized the vital signs, the sequence of her interventions. And his eyes changed. They went from professional to something else, something that recognized something. He found her at the medication station afterward, his voice low, dropping below the ambient noise of the ICU. "I've seen that triage sequence before. Baghdad Central. Summer of '09. Margaret didn't flinch. She didn't look up from the medication bottle she was documenting. "You might have," she said, her voice barely above a professional murmur. "A lot of us were working there." He nodded once, a slight expression crossing his face that might have been respect or might have been the beginning of an understanding he shouldn't have, and then he walked away. Margaret stood very still for 6 seconds. The combat medic from the 3rd Marines had seen something in her hands, something in her muscle memory, something that no 8 months of nursing at Seattle General could completely erase. Her cover hadn't cracked. Not yet. But she was now operating on borrowed time, and Admiral Kerrigan was upstairs in post-surgical recovery, and somewhere in this hospital, Dr. Pierce was building a case against her with the precision of a man who'd learned to destroy threats before they could destroy him. She finished documenting the medication and went back to work, her composure perfect, her hand steady, the faded unit patch sewn into her jacket lining a weight against her ribs like a promise she was going to keep or die trying. Dr. Pierce's voice carried through room 347 like a blade sharpening itself against stone. Margaret stood at the foot of Admiral Kerrigan's bed, the patient's 3 adult children flanking him, their faces caught between concern and confusion as their father's physician rounded on her with the precision of a man practicing a speech he'd perfected 100 times in the mirror. "Nurse Walsh, perhaps you can explain to this family why you documented their father received a CT scan yesterday when according to your notes he was physically unable to be transported from this unit." The Admiral's children looked at Margaret. The older daughter leaned forward. Pierce's jaw worked like machinery grinding through gears, his eyes narrowing into the kind of focus that came from someone who'd already decided the outcome. Margaret's hand steadied on the clipboard. Her pulse didn't accelerate. Her breathing didn't change. She'd faced worse than a territorial doctor in scrubs, she'd faced mortar fire at the embassy, held pressure on wounds while rounds snapped overhead, assessed casualties with body parts missing. This was theater. "The scan didn't happen, doctor. Because you billed for a procedure that was never performed." The words came out flat, even, delivered with the kind of conversational tone someone might use to comment on the weather. The Admiral's eyes widened. One of his sons actually took a step back, as if he'd watched a nurse just pull a grenade pin. Pierce's face deepened to a color that would have alarmed any cardiologist. His hands clenched and unclenched at his sides. "Your insubordination is noted. You're dismissed." Margaret held his gaze for exactly 3 seconds, long enough to ensure he understood she wasn't breaking eye contact because she was afraid, but because she was choosing to look away. She turned and walked past him without another word, her footsteps measured and deliberate on the linoleum, each step a small bell tolling. The hallway air smelled like the antiseptic they used to wipe down monitors, sharp and sterile, nothing like the copper and diesel stench of Baghdad, nothing like what real crisis smelled like, and that clarity, the knowledge that she'd just looked a man in the eyes and told him exactly what he was, steadied her more than any breathing exercise could have. The break room the next morning held the texture of a space people vacated quickly. Margaret pushed through the door with her lunch container and the conversation died mid-sentence, the way sound stops when a vacuum forms. 3 nurses scattered like they'd been signaled, grabbing coffee cups and thermoses, vanishing through the opposite exit. She sat alone at the table for 20 minutes, eating her sandwich, her hand steady as surgical steel, her eyes focused on nothing in particular. The fluorescent panels overhead hummed their white noise. She finished and disposed of her trash without looking at anyone. By afternoon, something new appeared on the unit board in the main corridor, a sheet of white paper pinned among the shift announcements and continuing education schedules where everyone in the ICU would see it. She read it standing motionless, her posture unchanged, her face a closed door. Disciplinary action, Walsh, M., insubordination and failure to follow chain of command. Formal reprimand documented. The document was dated today, printed on hospital letterhead, Dr. Pierce's signature bold at the bottom like a brand. A younger nurse, someone Margaret had helped orientate 3 weeks ago, whispered to her colleague as they passed, the words carrying that particular cruelty of people who thought they were speaking just quietly enough. Scary Margaret finally got what she deserved. Margaret didn't turn. She read the notice one more time, then returned to her rounds as if the public humiliation was a weather report, something that happened in the external world and didn't require internal response. Her shift that evening shifted parameters. She arrived for her scheduled 7 a.m. start and found a printed notice on the unit assignment board, Walsh reassigned to night rotation, 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., effective immediately. The handwriting was administrative, not Pierce's, but the message was unmistakable. She was being lifted out of the ICU's daylight hours, separated from the monitoring she'd been conducting, isolated from the Admiral's daily rounds. That night at 2 a.m., Margaret pulled Admiral Kerrigan's billing records in the records room, a basement space that smelled like aging paper and the ghost of coffee spilled weeks ago. The fluorescent panel above flickered in a pattern that suggested it hadn't been serviced since the Obama administration. She photographed codes with her phone, the screen's light casting her face in blue, 17 imaging studies listed in 3 weeks. CTs of the chest. MRIs of the abdomen. PET scans that made no clinical sense given the Admiral's presentation and stability. None matched the transport logs, the physical record that showed the Admiral had never left his bed, never made the journey to radiology, never received these procedures. The timestamps alone were damning, procedures documented as completed while the Admiral remained on the unit, vitals recorded by her own hand at the exact moments Pierce's phantom scans supposedly occurred. She photographed each page with the methodical precision of someone who'd photographed weapons caches in Sadr City, evidence of weapon smuggling in Fallujah, documentation that had ended careers and locked people in federal prisons. The Admiral remained stable in ICU bed 12, his chest tubes draining pink fluid into a calibrated chamber, vitals steady at 118/72, his oxygen saturation holding at 97% on room air. She could have walked away. She had sufficient evidence. She could have contacted her handler, submitted the files, let the Pentagon handle the rest. Instead, she kept working, kept watching, kept documenting. Pierce didn't confront her directly anymore. That was the shift, the escalation, the thing that made this moment different from his initial loud brutality. Instead, he made phone calls. Margaret overheard fragments through his office door on the 3rd night of her new assignment, pieces of conversation that leaked through the gap between frame and wall, credential irregularities and patient safety concerns mentioned to someone in hospital counsel, his voice smooth and concerned, the voice of a man protecting institutional safety, of a man worried about standards and oversight. He reassigned her primary patients, rotating her to different wings on different shifts so she never maintained continuity of care, so no relationship formed that might give her leverage or confidence. When she submitted a request to be assigned as the Admiral's primary nurse for the night rotation, Pierce denied it with a written memo citing inappropriate attachment to specific patients and potential compromised objectivity. The words were chosen with care, designed to look protective, to establish the narrative that she was the problem, that she represented a threat to patient welfare. The Admiral told her during a 3 a.m. vital check, his voice weak but sharp, the voice of a man who'd been reading personnel changes and understanding exactly what they signified, "They're trying to isolate you, Captain." Margaret pressed a finger to her lips, her eyes steady on his monitors. "I'm just a nurse, Admiral. Rest now." But that night, after her shift ended, she encrypted files to a Pentagon address, timestamps, billing codes, procedure names that didn't match clinical necessity, the whole architecture of the scheme laid out in database format. She sent them at 4:41 a.m. from her personal encrypted device in her car, parked 3 blocks from the hospital. Her son called her that afternoon. She didn't answer. Her son called again. She silenced it, too focused on the work, too focused on the narrowing space between her cover and exposure. Pierce made a third call on day 6 of her new rotation, this time to the credentialing office, his voice suggesting concern, suggesting duty, suggesting that he was doing the responsible thing. Margaret found out through a memo placed in her staff file, routine credentialing review for Walsh, M., pending investigation of discrepancies in nursing license application. The walls were closing. The timetable, which had been measured and strategic, was accelerating into something faster, something that suggested Pierce had recognized the threat and moved from institutional pressure into active sabotage. She had days, maybe less. The phone on her kitchen counter that evening remained silent, the Pentagon still processing the files, still determining response, still moving at the speed of military bureaucracy while her cover eroded in real time. Thunder rolled across San Antonio like distant artillery, and Margaret sat in the darkness without turning on a light, her hand resting on the unit patch sewn into her jacket lining, thinking about promises and about the last time she'd been this close to losing everything. The night shift at Seattle General moved like a heartbeat, predictable, steady, invisible to the daylight world above. Margaret descended the concrete stairs to the records basement at 2:07 a.m., her badge clipped to her waistband, her scanner tucked into the loose pocket of her scrubs where no one would think to look twice. The basement exhaled cold air that smelled like old paper and industrial cleaners, fluorescent panels casting everything in monochrome. She'd done this for 11 nights now, and no one had questioned her presence. A nurse pulling charts for morning rounds. Routine. Unremarkable. The records room was a maze of filing cabinets and lateral drawers, organized by patient ID and admission date. Admiral Kerrigan's file was thicker than most, 6 weeks of cardiac workup, imaging studies, consultation notes. Margaret pulled the folder and sat at one of the metal tables, spreading the pages under the humming lights. Her hands moved with the steady precision that came from 17 years of reading medical records in field hospitals and combat zones, from midnight briefings where a single misplaced comma could mean the difference between extraction and extraction failure. She photographed each page with her phone, the camera's flash dimmed, taking screenshots of billing codes and diagnostic studies that made no clinical sense. The pattern was there if you knew how to read it. It was there in the phantom 64-slice CT scans ordered the same day as legitimate ultrasounds, never performed, always billed at $4,200 each. It was there in the cardiac MRI studies coded to Admiral Kerrigan's account but stamped with a radiology time slot that overlapped with 2 other patients' procedures in the same imaging suite, impossible if simultaneous. It was there in the diagnostic codes Dr. Pierce himself had signed off on, linked to a vendor called Meridian Diagnostics, which Margaret's phone had already identified as a shell company. The wire transfers would be next, hidden in hospital accounts, routed offshore through 3 different banks. $50,000 a month. Maybe more. She photographed the last page, a billing summary dated 4 days ago, and slipped the folder back into its slot. The basement was silent except for the ventilation system's distant roar. Margaret climbed the stairs at 2:34 a.m., her mind already 3 steps ahead of her feet. She'd need to photograph the vendor contracts next, the ones Dr. Pierce kept in his office. She'd need to confirm the kickback amount before she reported up the chain. The Pentagon would want numbers, not suspicions. Admiral Kerrigan was the witness to something bigger, something that had reached the highest levels of procurement authority. Margaret was here to protect him, which meant she needed ironclad proof. The ICU was in soft night mode when she returned, monitor beeps the only conversation, ventilators wheeze breathing their mechanical rhythms like sleeping giants. Margaret passed the nursing station without pausing, dropped off the charts she'd allegedly been retrieving, and began her medication rounds. But her attention was elsewhere, tracking the patterns in the admission logs. Kerrigan's cardiac status was stable, which meant the imaging studies would continue. Stress tests. Catheterizations. Procedures that gave Dr. Pierce opportunities to bill and bill again. What she didn't anticipate was how quickly Pierce would move to isolate her. The schedule change appeared on the unit board at 6:15 a.m., printed and posted before the day's shift arrived. Margaret saw it while restocking supplies, her name removed from the cardiac ICU rotation, her 12-hour shifts now assigned to the pediatric wing on the 3rd floor. A transfer. Administrative, the notation read. Effective immediately. No explanation. No discussion. She'd been on the same unit for 8 months, and now she was being scattered to a different floor with a different patient load, a different patient profile, a different vantage point. A different view of Admiral Kerrigan. Pierce was moving to stage 4. Not social attacks anymore, that was children's games. This was strategic architecture, the removal of opposition pieces from the board. Margaret acknowledged the schedule change without any visible reaction, her face as neutral as clean tile. But something shifted inside her, something that had been dormant since Baghdad began to calibrate. This was familiar territory now. This was the chess game that happened before the shooting started. She worked her pediatric shift that day with mechanical precision, dispensing medications to children with pneumonia and acute leukemia, monitoring vitals on post-surgical patients who ranged from 3 years old to 16. The work was good work. Necessary work. But her attention drifted downward, for floors down, to the cardiac ICU where Admiral Kerrigan was waiting for his next procedure. Catheterization was scheduled for day 12, today was day 11. She'd seen the pre-op orders that morning, had memorized the timing while pretending to check a medication code. 2:41 p.m. transport to radiology. 30-minute procedure window. Standard cardiac workup. Dr. Pierce would be tracking that schedule. Dr. Pierce would make sure no one who asked questions was anywhere near that patient during the procedure window. At 1:33 p.m., Margaret abandoned her medication cart on the 3rd floor and took the stairwell down for flights. She moved like a shadow between hallways, unremarkable in her scrubs, just another nurse in a hospital where 300 people wore the same uniform. The cardiac ICU elevator doors opened, and she saw the transport team, 2 orderlies and a nursing assistant she didn't recognize, pushing the stretcher toward the corridor that led to radiology. Admiral Kerrigan lay on the stretcher in a hospital gown, his oxygen cannula in place, his chest tube secured with tape that looked, from her angle, like it had begun to separate from his skin. She followed at a distance, staying near the wall, letting the overhead pages and hallway traffic camouflage her presence. The transport team moved with the practiced sluggishness of people who'd moved 1,000 patients and would move 1,000 more. They turned the corner toward the radiology wing, the stretcher wheels squeaking against the linoleum, and Margaret watched from the intersection as the chest tube shifted. Shifted again. The connector was separating from the drainage port. Everything after that moved in fragments. The transport team wasn't watching the tube, why would they? It was a nurse's job, a technical detail, invisible to everyone except the person trained to see it. They navigated the corner too tightly, the stretcher angle too steep, and the tube pulled further. Margaret could see it now with absolute clarity, the way metal disengaged from plastic, the way a sealed system opened to atmosphere. Tension pneumothorax develops in seconds. A collapsed lung trapped air with nowhere to exit, pressure mounting in the chest cavity, compressing the heart, strangling its ability to pump. You didn't call for backup in tension pneumothorax. You acted because backup arrived too slowly to matter. Margaret started moving. Not running, running caused attention, caused security footage to trigger, caused questions. Walking fast, the kind of urgent but professional walk that nurses used when something needed fixing. She caught up to the stretcher at the radiology corridor intersection, and Admiral Kerrigan's lips were already turning blue. His eyes found hers. She saw recognition flicker across his face, something about her presence registered as correct, as necessary. She didn't know if he remembered her from Baghdad, from the embassy clinic, from before this undercover assignment had become her entire world. But his body relaxed when he saw her, the way people relax when the right person shows up. "Chest tube," she said to the transport team. "Disconnect. Move him back to ICU, now." The nursing assistant looked confused. "We were ordered to radiology. The tube's disconnected. His intention pneumothorax. We do radiology never, or we do it after we fix this. Which would you prefer?" They moved. Margaret was already opening the crash cart that she'd grabbed from the hallway, the one every transport team carried, though most of them had never needed to use it. She located the 14-gauge angiocath needle, the kind designed for the specific purpose of penetrating ribcage and releasing pressure. Her hands knew this procedure like they knew breathing. Second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, straight in at 90 degrees. The physics were simple: find the pocket of air, give it an exit route, let the pressure equalize. Dr. Pierce appeared from the radiology office like he'd been waiting in that hallway specifically to wait. His face was the color of old money, and his voice came out like a steel door slamming. "Nurse Walsh, you are not assigned to this patient. Step back immediately." Margaret didn't look at him. She prepped the insertion site with an alcohol swab, her movements economical and certain. The Admiral's oxygen saturation was dropping, 68%, 65%, the monitor showing numbers that spelled cardiac arrest in perhaps 90 seconds if she didn't act. "You are in direct violation of the assignment roster," Pierce continued, and now he was moving toward her, his hand reaching for her shoulder. "Security is being called. You are terminated, effective immediately. If I don't do this in the next 30 seconds, he dies," Margaret said. It wasn't aggressive. It wasn't emotional. It was the kind of statement you made when describing physics, when stating simple fact. She positioned the needle between the Admiral's ribs, felt for the right angle, the right depth. Pierce's hand closed around her shoulder, pulling. She drove the needle through. The hiss of air escaping was immediate and unmistakable, a sound like pressure release, like correction, like a lung remembering how to expand. The oxygen monitor climbed, 70%, 75%, 82%, moving back toward viable. Admiral Kerrigan gasped, his color returning from blue toward human, his eyes still locked on Margaret's face. "Stable," one of the transport orderlies whispered, watching the monitor. Pierce released her shoulder. She turned to look at him then, and something in her eyes made him step backward. This was the moment where masks could slip if you weren't careful, where a decorated Navy captain's composure could fracture under pressure. But Margaret had held position in Baghdad with mortar rounds walking down the clinic walls. She had held position while her friends' names were called by ID number instead of by name. This was nothing. This was administrative theater. "Call this in," Margaret said to the nursing assistant. "Contact ICU. Tell them tension pneumothorax resolved by needle decompression, patient stable for immediate transport back to the unit. Now." They moved. The stretcher turned, the wheels squeaking their urgent song, and Margaret followed without looking back at Pierce. She was no longer assigned to Admiral Kerrigan, but she was still the person who'd made sure he lived to see radiology another day. Behind her, Dr. Pierce stood alone in the radiology corridor, understanding for the first time that he'd made a calculation error. He'd assumed Margaret Walsh was what she appeared to be, a competent but ordinary nurse who could be isolated and managed and eventually dismissed. He was about to discover how wrong that assessment was. The chest tube disconnected between the third and fourth floor. One moment Admiral Kerrigan's oxygen saturation was stable at 92%, the next the monitor shrieked a two-tone alarm that made every nurse within 50 feet stop mid-task. The transport stretcher lurched to a halt in the stairwell. A resident froze, staring at the disconnected tubing like it might bite him. 53 seconds. That's how long his oxygen would sustain him before the numbers started falling. Margaret heard the alarm from pediatrics where Pierce had reassigned her that morning. She didn't hesitate. Her hands were already moving, already knowing what her brain hadn't finished processing. She abandoned the patient she was charting on, pushed through the stairwell door, and moved downward at a pace that looked like a walk but covered ground like a sprint. The resident saw her coming and stepped aside without being asked. He knew what she was. He just didn't know what that meant yet. Admiral Kerrigan's lung had collapsed. She could see it in the way his chest moved, asymmetrical, the left side rising less than the right, the accessory muscles in his neck straining like rope pulled too tight. His skin had taken on that particular shade of blue that meant his body was rationing oxygen to the brain. 40 seconds remained. Maybe less. 14-gauge angiocath, Margaret said. Not a request. A command that sounded like someone used to giving them, used to having them obeyed instantly. The resident handed it over without question. Second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. Now. She didn't ask for permission. Didn't wait for another physician. The needle slid through skin and muscle and into the pleural space with the kind of precise, practice motion that only comes from muscle memory operating without conscious thought. 7 years of medical school. 12 years as a Navy corpsman before that. 14 months deployed to Baghdad Central during the embassy siege. Her hands knew the geography of a human chest the way a pilot knows an cockpit. The pressurized air didn't escape. It exploded. The hiss became a shriek, became a physical force that burst outward from the needle hub like a shock wave. Decades of accumulated pressure seeking escape all at once, decompressing with violent urgency. The sound wave traveled directly into both of Margaret's ear canals with the force of a concussion blast. No warning. No protection. Just the sudden, catastrophic rupture of the tympanic membranes on both sides as the pressure differential tore through delicate tissue like paper. The world went silent. Not quiet. Not muffled. Gone. Complete and total silence, like someone had cut the audio from reality itself. Margaret blinked and the silence remained, absolute and ringing. She saw Kerrigan's oxygen saturation climb on the monitor, 76%, 82%, 88%, saw his chest rising normally again, the asymmetry correcting itself, his skin color shifting from blue back toward pink. The medical crisis resolved in the space of one breath. The physical crisis in her head had just begun. Blood trickled warm down both sides of her neck. She could feel it but couldn't hear it. Couldn't hear Kerrigan's ragged breathing normalizing. Couldn't hear the resident asking if she was all right. Couldn't hear the footsteps thundering up the stairwell, security, responding to the alarm, responding to what they thought was a code. She saw their mouths moving. Saw the resident pointing at her bleeding ears. Saw Dr. Pierce arrive at the stairwell landing, his expression shifting from anger to something colder and far more calculated. He smiled. He shouldn't have. Pierce pointed at the exit, his lips forming words she could read even through the ringing silence that filled her skull. You're done. Not an accusation. A statement of fact. A decision already made. He pulled out his phone and made a call. She watched his lips move, watched him gesture toward Kerrigan, watched him turn to security with the expression of a man reporting a problem that needed immediate solving. 2 security guards approached Margaret with the kind of gentle firmness reserved for confused patients. She didn't resist. What would be the point? She'd accomplished what she came here to do. Admiral Kerrigan was stable. The mission was complete. And she was about to be erased. The Human Resources office was on the 2nd floor. The paperwork was already waiting on the desk. Margaret could read the heading upside down: medication administration error, patient safety concern, immediate termination. The date was 3 days prior. The signature was Dr. Pierce's, written in the careful, deliberate script of a man covering his tracks. She'd exposed his phantom billing scheme. He'd fabricated a termination reason that made her look dangerous. They were both professionals. They were both very, very good at their jobs. Her badge was deactivated before she reached the parking lot. The electronic reader on the exit door flashed red when she swiped it. A guard escorted her to the exit with something that might have been sympathy if the silence hadn't made the whole thing seem like a pantomime. She gathered her belongings from her locker, a cracked coffee mug from a Baghdad bakery, a wilting pothose plant someone had given her on day 1, a photograph of her unit standing in the courtyard of the embassy compound. Half the faces were crossed with black bands now. Some of those people were still there, still carrying what happened. Rain hammered the parking lot like applause. Margaret sat at the bus stop on Martin Street with the cardboard box balanced on her knees, her scrub soaked through, water streaming from her hair. The photograph in her hands was bleeding, the names she'd written on the back running in blue ink, the black band smudging. She couldn't hear the rain. Couldn't hear the traffic passing. Couldn't hear the phone vibrating repeatedly in her pocket with text messages she couldn't possibly answer because she didn't know what anyone was saying and had no way to ask. An hour passed in the rain. Maybe longer. Time felt different when there was no sound to mark its passage. Just the ringing in her head, constant and absolute, the sound of both eardrums rupturing playing on a loop inside her skull. She'd made tactical calculations her entire career about acceptable risk and mission probability, but she'd never calculated for permanent hearing loss. Never calculated for losing half the sensory input that kept a person tethered to the world. Her son found her there with the rain soaking through the cardboard box, the pothose plant drooping like something already dead. 17 years old, his hair dark and wet, his face showing the particular rage of someone who'd just been told his mother had been fired and had no idea why. He was carrying something wooden. A case. The case. "Mom, they need to see these," he said. She read his lips rather than heard him, had to watch the shape of each word to understand the meaning. He thrust the wooden case toward her, opened it to the rain like an offering to a god who'd stopped listening. The Bronze Star caught what little light remained in the San Antonio evening, its ribbon somehow still bright despite everything. The Purple Heart gleamed next to it, the profile of George Washington looking stoic and resigned. Margaret shook her head. Tried to refuse. Her son's mouth firmed into a line that looked exactly like her own, and then he turned and walked back toward the hospital entrance without waiting for her permission. She followed because she had no other choice, because 17-year-olds with that particular expression in their eyes didn't take no for an answer and probably got that from somewhere. The rain continued its applause as she walked behind him across the parking lot and through the automatic doors that hissed open like they were gasping for air. Her son walked straight to the security desk in the main lobby and opened the case. The Bronze Star and Purple Heart lay exposed under the fluorescent lights like evidence at a crime scene. The security guard's face changed. Changed again. Changed a third time as he made phone calls and checked credentials, and suddenly the lobby of Seattle General transformed into something resembling a military recruitment office. Admiral Kerrigan was wheeled down from the cardiac unit within minutes, his oxygen cannula hissing like a small, angry animal. He looked at Margaret standing there in soaked scrubs with blood dried on her neck and tears mixing with rainwater on her face. He understood before anyone else did. His mouth formed words that Margaret couldn't hear but could read, Nightingale 6. The call sign from Baghdad. The corpsman who'd held the line at the embassy while mortar rounds scattered around them like hail. The name meant nothing to most of the people in that lobby, but it meant everything to him. The Navy liaison officer who appeared seemed to materialize from nowhere, checking his phone, confirming data, nodding with the expression of someone whose entire day had just changed. A young Marine in dress blue stepped forward. Margaret's son must have called the base directly, must have known exactly who to contact and how, and he opened a leather folio containing an official citation. His voice carried through the atrium with the kind of clarity that made the fluorescent light seem quieter by comparison. For conspicuous gallantry under fire during sustained mortar attack, Captain Margaret Walsh of the United States Navy Medical Corps rendered aid to 37 wounded personnel while maintaining combat triage operations under conditions of extreme danger. The Marine's voice didn't waver. Didn't show a single crack of emotion even as hospital staff gathered, their phones coming out, recording this moment as it happened. She sustained injuries during that operation that would have incapacitated most personnel. She remained operational. She saved lives that would have been lost. Dr. Pierce pushed through the crowd with the particular fury of a man whose careful calculations had just been rendered obsolete. "This is a hospital, not a circus," he said, his voice sharp enough to cut. "This woman is no longer employed here, and this display is completely inappropriate." A woman in a dark suit stepped forward. "FBI." Margaret could read the credentials from 6 feet away. The agent's phone was to her ear, and her eyes were fixed on Pierce with the intensity of a predator that had finally cornered its prey. Captain Walsh's assignment here was authorized under National Security Directive 47, the agent said. Dr. Pierce, we have questions about the phantom imaging studies. About the kickback arrangements with Stellar Diagnostics. About the investigation Captain Walsh was conducting before her termination. Pierce's face drained of color like someone had pulled a stopper. 2 more agents appeared at the lobby exits. They moved with the kind of fluid coordination that suggested they'd been waiting for this moment, had probably been waiting in the building all along, watching, documenting, waiting for the right moment to move. Pierce backed toward the corridor that led to the administrative offices, but they cut him off with the casual efficiency of people who'd done this hundreds of times before. Margaret stood in the center of the lobby, dripping rainwater onto the polished tile, and felt the weight of the moment without being able to hear it. The ringing in her ears continued its absolute, unrelenting song, but for the first time since the needle decompression, she smiled. Sometimes the bravest warriors carry stethoscopes, not guns. The cardboard box felt heavier than it should have been, balanced on Margaret's knees as rain hammered the bus stop shelter like mortar fire. Inside, a cracked coffee mug from Baghdad, a wilting pothose plant she'd kept alive through 8 months of undercover work, and a photograph of her unit with half the faces crossed by black bands. The ones who didn't come home. Her security badge lay in the recycling bin 3 blocks back, deactivated at 3:48 p.m., the exact moment Dr. Pierce had fabricated the medication error into the system. Not a mistake. A weapon. He'd backdated it to yesterday, creating documentation of a non-existent error, a phantom crime to justify her termination before the FBI could arrive. Smart. Calculated. Desperate. The rain soaked through her scrubs as she sat motionless, her newly deaf ears registering only vibration and pressure change, the world reduced to sight and touch. Her cover was destroyed. Admiral Kerrigan was still alive but unprotected, his new wing assignment meaning she could no longer watch for the person Pierce had undoubtedly already contacted, the people who wanted that procurement scandal buried so deep it would never surface again. A car pulled up. A familiar truck. Her son's hands moved as he approached, shouting something she couldn't hear, his mouth shaping words in the rain. He was 17. He shouldn't have known anything. She shook her head, trying to motion him away, but he pressed a wooden case into her trembling hands, the case she'd hidden in the garage for 8 years, the case containing things that had no place in a nurse's life. She tried to hand it back, tried to push him away, but he was already moving, already walking past her toward the hospital entrance 3 blocks distant, the case open now, the medals visible even from here. Bronze Star. Purple Heart. He was walking into the lobby on a Saturday evening with her entire classified service record illuminated under fluorescent lights like a confession. What happened next didn't just end Dr. Pierce's career. It ended the quiet. Hospital security was called. Security footage was pulled. The medals glowed under the harsh artificial light, and within 90 seconds a crowd had formed, nurses who'd avoided her, technicians who'd whispered her name, doctors who'd laughed at her silence. A young Marine in dress blues appeared with a citation folder, apparently already staged by someone who'd been expecting this moment, waiting. Admiral Kerrigan was wheeled down from the cardiac unit, his four-pole rolling alongside him like a metal companion, and when he saw Margaret's face and the medals catching the light, his entire body went still. He whispered a name that wasn't hers. Nightingale 6. The call sign. The one she hadn't heard spoken aloud in 8 years. The corpsman who'd held the line at the embassy when the mortar rounds came. The one who'd extracted 12 casualties under direct fire. The one who'd never left a soldier behind. His eyes went wet with recognition, with understanding, with the crushing weight of knowing exactly who had been caring for him. The Marine's voice carried through the atrium, resonating off tile and metal and glass, for conspicuous gallantry under fire. Captain Margaret Walsh rendered aid to 37 wounded personnel while under sustained mortar attack. Captain. The word hung in the air like a physical thing. Not nurse. Not medication error. Captain. Margaret's newly damaged ear began to bleed again, Old trauma meeting new, the permanent hearing damage from a mortar impact at 40 meters suddenly explained by someone reading official words into the shocked silence. The crowd shifted. People looked away. The break room exodus had been a mistake. The discipline had been a mistake. Everything Pierce had done had been built on sand, on the assumption that a quiet woman with steady hands was ordinary. He wasn't. Dr. Pierce pushed through the crowd from his office corridor, his face a mixture of rage and confusion. This is a hospital, not a circus, and this woman is no longer employed here. His voice like a man who still believed authority was a sufficient weapon. But then a woman in a charcoal suit stepped forward, phone already to her ear, and said 5 words that changed everything. Captain Walsh's assignment here was authorized under National Security Directive 47, and Dr. Pierce, the FBI has questions about your billing records. The investigator's badge was visible for approximately 3 seconds before Dr. Pierce's hands began to tremble. Not anger. Fear. He tried to fabricate Margaret's personnel file more thoroughly, to manufacture additional evidence to justify the termination, to bury the truth so deep it could never surface. But every keystroke had been logged. Every alteration timestamped. The FBI had been monitoring the system for weeks, watching him dig himself deeper with every attempt to cover his tracks. FBI agents appeared beside him with the efficiency of people who'd been waiting for this exact moment. He wasn't cuffed in his office. He was walked through the corridor in handcuffs, his protests echoing off tile. I'm the unit director, you can't. His voice grew smaller with each step, reduced to the size of a frightened man in a hospital he'd ruled just hours before. The pharmaceutical kickbacks with Meridian Diagnostics. The phantom billing. The falsification of medical records. The obstruction. The witness intimidation. Each charge mounting like stones in his pockets as he walked past the nursing station where his discipline notices were being removed by administrators who were already calculating liability, already preparing apologies, already running calculations on how much Margaret would cost them in back pay and settlement fees. A younger doctor who'd participated in the break room exile stared at her with dawning horror. Margaret didn't look away. She met his eyes with the flat, frozen stare of someone who'd survived worse than social exile. She'd survived Baghdad. She'd survived 8 months of humiliation. She'd survived fire. The Marine continued reading through the official words. Captain Walsh personally extracted 12 casualties under direct fire, sustaining shrapnel wounds to her left side and permanent hearing damage from a mortar impact at 40 meters. Margaret's newly bleeding ear dripped blood onto her collar, and Admiral Kerrigan, still in his wheelchair, still tethered to his footpole, managed a crisp salute. His hand went to his chest. His fingers extended in perfect military form. A salute of recognition. A salute of respect. A salute acknowledging that they'd both survived something that most people couldn't imagine. Hospital security removed the formal write-up from the unit board as camera flashes erupted from phones throughout the crowd. The ceremony at Seattle General wasn't an official military honor, it was a moment of reckoning, a public acknowledgement that the quiet woman they'd underestimated had been carrying something they couldn't see. 3 days later, Margaret stood on the stage at San Antonio Naval Station in her dress uniform, the one she hadn't worn since her assignment began. The fabric felt foreign against her skin, the brass buttons reflecting light like eyes watching her from outside her own body. Her son stood beside her, and his hands were steady as he pinned the Meritorious Service Medal to her chest. For extraordinary valor in the performance of duties while operating under deep cover to protect a critical national security witness. The medal was heavier than it should have been, and Margaret's hand went to it immediately, touching the metal as if to confirm it was real. The base commander's voice seemed to come from underwater, muffled and distant, but the words were clear: extraordinary valor, deep cover, critical national security. The formal acknowledgement that she'd been exactly what she claimed to be. Exactly what she'd always been. A captain. A warrior. A hero. Her former colleagues watched from Seattle General's conference room via live feed, the same room where Dr. Pierce had held staff meetings where people laughed about the quiet nurse, the one who didn't belong. The hospital CEO would issue a formal apology, offering full reinstatement with back pay stretching back 8 months. Margaret would decline. Her assignment was complete. Her target was protected. Admiral Kerrigan attended the ceremony in dress whites, his chest tube finally removed, and he rendered a salute that made 3 Marines in the audience tear up. Margaret returned it without hesitation, her hand moving with the muscle memory of 8 years of service, of a life that had never really stopped being military no matter what uniform she wore. Dr. Pierce, stripped of his medical license pending criminal trial, reportedly found work teaching CPR at a community college for $15 an hour. Federal prosecutors pursued charges: healthcare fraud, falsification of records, obstruction of a federal investigation, witness intimidation. The irony wasn't lost on anyone, a man who'd spent years billing for procedures that never happened, now teaching people how to save lives for minimum wage. Margaret's hand dropped to the faded unit patch sewn inside her jacket lining, the one she'd carried through Baghdad, through 8 months undercover, through the rain at the bus stop. Her son leaned close, speaking directly into her one partially functional ear. "They needed to see who you really are, Mom." The ceremony ended with a 21-gun salute that she felt more than heard, each percussion wave traveling through her chest like a second heartbeat, like a welcome home, like an ending and a beginning existing in the same moment. Later, at the reception, a young corpsman approached nervously and asked what it was like, working in silence for all those months. Margaret touched the medal on her chest and replied, "Sometimes the bravest warriors carry stethoscopes, not guns." The camera pulled back as she stood with her son, Admiral Kerrigan, and the Marines who'd read her citation, finally allowed to come home. Like this video if you support our troops. And if you or someone you love has served, let us know in the comments, we'd be honored to hear from you. Subscribe and let's get back to the story.